going on to our next, argument of secession, and this is something you've written about extensively, is the lost cause and this sort of propagated myth that has permeated throughout American history. So, what exactly is the lost cause?
Yeah, excellent question. 'Cause this is something that people are sort of still heavily debated even today. Well, essentially, it is a belief that was propagated by people. Well, I'll talk more about that in a moment. About the idea that the South was justified in what they did, that we didn't win the war, but we didn't lose. That is the idea that just because we were not successful doesn't mean that we were not able to sort of fight the gallant fight. That is the big thing. And this goes back to, in some ways, a big key debate. I think a big idea. It comes up in a lot of very famous scholars. In particular, Bertram Wyatt Brown wrote an excellent book on Southern honor, literally called, I think, Southern Honor. And he goes back to these ideas that it's a very chivalric society, almost medieval in some ways, sort of in its conceptions, at least when it comes to the understandings of masculinity, the understandings of femininity. It's very much kind of a continuation of that cultural idea. And one of the things that comes down to it is, how do we, as a society, protect the masculinity of our men when they are not successful in a conflict? When they are not able to be sort of these champions, these heroes, the people who are successful, how do we let them down, sort of let them be able to continue to exist without feeling like a failure? That is one of the big things that drives a lot of this. And because of that, again, it's a very heavily gendered ideology, again, sort of protecting masculinity, but is also primarily driven by women. So it is a feminine-driven ideology designed to prop up masculinity. One of the big things, again, that they often do, these sort of descendants of these Confederate veterans, they would quite literally, when the politicians were doing something they didn't like, they would say, hey, your Confederate forefathers would be disappointed in you because they were real men and you're not. So then they would say that, and then they're like, oh, well, yeah, of course we're going to approve all the stuff that you want. And it works. Like, they quite literally shamed them into saying, well, if you were a real man, you would do this. And it allows them to actually be very successful. They start sort of rewriting the story saying, oh yeah, the war, it wasn't about slavery. They said that it's only about states' rights. That's the idea. Of course, when you ask them states' rights to do what, they kind of get a little iffy. But it is very much a society-wide movement where they are reaching down into every level. There's no part of society that in some way doesn't play into this lost cause ideology. And it is rewriting the story saying, hey, we were all good people. Masters treated slaves kindly. Slaves loved being slaves, which again, if you look at the actual historical records, why are they running away if they love being slaves? Why are they having rebellions if they love being slaves? So it doesn't really line up with the historicity of it, but they are rewriting the history of it. And in many ways, this becomes the history that people study. That's one of the main things of a lot of my research, is focusing on their relationship with education, how they are able to get it into the textbooks, and then textbooks not just in the South, but in the North as well. And many of the people who end up sort of being taught the lost cause, they end up becoming the people who are the politicians during the Civil Rights era, the ones who are against integration, against and for segregation. They are the ones who are brought up on this belief. So it's always important to, because again, they start them with kids. They have whole organizations dedicated to teaching kids the holy cause of the Confederacy. They literally compare Jefferson Davis to Jesus, like multiple times. They call him the sufferer of the South because he suffered on the sort of pilloried in a way, even though if you actually look at the records of people during the war, a lot of people really hated Jefferson Davis. But then years later, they're like, oh, he was the greatest guy who ever lived. Like, they completely changed their whole dynamic on him. And in the process, they also kind of forget, because it is remembering a specific point of view. Again, remembering that we are the good guys, we're not the baddies. But also the idea that really you have that core concept that not everybody in the South supported the Confederacy. This is something that I hope we'll be able to come back to when we talk a bit more about Lincoln. But there are a lot of people there who are pro-Union. Again, even my own family. I had family who were Southerners who were Unionists. They fought for the Union from Tennessee. So there are people who are very much not part of this Confederate war machine, but they're also completely forgotten about when it comes to the actual history of the war, because whenever the story comes out, it's all Southerners supported the Confederacy. They all loved it. The people who were quite literally leading raids, attacks against other Southerners, completely forgotten. Their stories are not remembered. They've tried to recover them, but in many ways, they're just not something that is easily captured, because they are deliberately chosen to forget. Because the average person doesn't like complexity. Historians love complexity. That's the thing that drives us. The nuances, the levels of gray. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to create a nice, pat, monolithic version of the South. Everyone loved slavery. Slavery wasn't bad. Everybody was good. Nobody liked the North. And that's just not the way it is. That's just not the reality of the situation. But it's still the thing that most people believe. Southern Unionists are still very rarely discussed. There have been new literature on them in the last decade or so, but they're actively recovering these stories, which I think is important to really be able to understand and grasp the real complexity of the Civil War beyond just all Northerners supported the North, which they didn't, and all Southerners supported the South, which they didn't. I think it is important to recover some of those stories that have been deliberately forgotten due to sort of the efforts of these, again, primarily women who are leading these movements.
Yeah, I agree. I hate that this has become sort of a black and white issue in mainstream narratives. This is such a complex and nuanced conflict in American history, like you just said. But when it comes to the Lost Cause, it seems that part of this was addressing an identity crisis following the Civil War of the South, which I do think there is some validity to and some good intention, because I know a part of Reconstruction was bringing the North and South back together. So you don't want half of the population, being the South, to feel this animosity and this burden and this guilt and this sense of defeat. You want them to come back into the Union. You want to welcome them so you can be a strong, united nation once again. But on the flip side of that, it's obviously not a good thing to rewrite history that didn't necessarily happen or didn't play out that way, and rewriting the history books and permeating propaganda throughout history.
Yeah, especially since so much of the ideology that ends up fueling the Lost Cause is inherently sort of white supremacist in its way. It is primarily designed to strip power away from African Americans. That is one of the main focuses of it. So I think that is, again, sort of has a very negative connotation. Again, it is a defense mechanism. I think that's what came to my mind when you were talking about it. It is something that they do to protect themselves. And it's something that, again, serves a political purpose. Because women at the time were not able to vote. Again, they don't get the vote till much later. 1890s is really when this Lost Cause is started. But the thing is that kind of drives a lot of that is the idea that, you know, we want to make sure that future generations remember it the correct way. To remember it sort of as a protection of our values, and it becomes very closely linked to the original incarnation, particularly of the Democratic Party, the one that, again, sort of not necessarily the Democratic Party of today, which, again, very different, but the Democratic Party of the South, the party that dominated the South's politics from like 1820s up to about 1960s. That is the era of these politicians that are able to become powerful because they cater to these people who are sort of these lost causers, these neo-Confederates, if you will. And women, again, they're not able to vote, but using this, because the only thing that women were traditionally allowed to do, they were only really able to sort of take care of the house, take care of their children, their husband, and the elderly. That's the three things that women are allowed to do. Even Southern women, that's kind of the limitations placed upon them, this sort of idea of the separate spheres, the public sphere versus the private sphere. And ultimately, this is the thing that allows them to have political power, although it's indirect political power. What they're doing is they are able to lobby these politicians to give them, you know, let's build a home for Confederate veterans, let's build a Confederate monument. They're able to get money and support from the politicians to do this because they are saying this is an extension of our duties. We are protecting our fathers. We are protecting the legacy of our sons it's something that is inherently rooted in the jobs, the duties that women are expected to do in society. So ultimately, they're able to have political power without the right to vote simply by expanding their already sort of assigned duties. And I think that's something really important because it is, again, the 1990s, this is the period of time where you see huge organizations, women creating massive organizations, whether it's Daughters of the American Revolution, which have been around before that, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. You see like all these organizations that exist to promote, help, do whatever they can, benevolent organizations. And that is a form of politics. It's a form of sort of the politics of the people, as opposed to being able to vote directly, but they are able to express power in a way that women were not traditionally allowed to express, at least until they get the right to vote. So it's something that in some ways is a major part of women's history that, again, is often sort of overlooked. Again, sort of not necessarily always a positive version of women history, because some of the stuff that they're using it for, but it is a sort of advancement of what women are and what women are expected to be, at least within the Southern context.
So this myth, you mentioned it kind of stems from the 1890s, and it's largely driven by women, the daughters of the Confederacy. So kind of explain a little more how this lost cause myth kind of began and permeated into the Southern culture and American history.
Great question. So it kind of started in the 1890s again. That's the point where they realized a lot of these Confederate veterans are dying off, or they're at least getting very old. So the very first groups were these called Ladies' Memorial Associations. They kind of start in the right after sort of Reconstruction, and they eventually do become the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This is something written about a lot by Karen Copps, excellent historian, fantastic writer, who dives into a lot of these ideas. With her book Dixie's Daughters, it's a sort of key book to a lot of what I do. And I think one of the things that sort of drives it so much is the idea that, again, we want to sort of protect them because they're no longer going to be here. Again, men are, at least at this point, we're expected to be inherently political. They are people that they can vote, that if they are sort of saying, hey, the Confederacy was right, then the North would get sort of pay attention to that and be like, maybe not. They would crack down on them a little bit. But because women were not expected to have political power, that therefore them saying these things were not political. And that is one of the big things, because they said, oh, well, they're just being women. They're just talking about things that matter to them. That's not political, because they don't recognize it as that. So they're allowed to keep these ideas going in ways that men are not able to. And whenever men do, they are saying we're doing it by catering to our women. So that's one of the things that drives a lot of it. That's kind of how it starts. It starts out wanting to be primarily kind of, I don't want to say like death focused, but it's primarily focused on graves, graveyards, cemeteries. That's where it starts. The memorials sort of for these people who are dead. But then it starts to become less about honoring the dead and more about honoring the still living veterans. And then it becomes more about how, once all the veterans are gone, it becomes how do we continue to protect them even though they're dead? How do we protect their legacy? So it's no longer about taking care of them, giving them food, giving them a place to stay. It becomes how do we protect this idea, to protect that they are the real masculine men, sort of through those rose-colored glasses that our men today are not. That's kind of the way that it starts. But then it becomes, they get involved, because one of the other things that women are expected to be involved in, again, the idea of Republican motherhood, they are seen as transmitters of culture. They're the ones that are seen as being able to teach children. It's one of the reasons why teaching, at least sort of at the elementary school through high school level, was always sort of predominantly seen as female in a lot of ways, is sort of an expectation that women are the ones who are doing this. So women, again, members of these organizations, they are the ones that are very active in sort of like school boards. They're very active in sort of, even if they're not on the school boards, at least working with the school boards. They're very interested in what's being taught. They create whole committees that exist to monitor every textbook being released in the country to determine if it's fair to the South. And then they will lobby the schools to adapt this book, to throw out this other book. There are instances of them saying, this is a good book, but except for these 2 pages, tape those 2 pages together so that students can't read them. Like, they would literally do things like that. And it creates, and many times, again, a lot of these women become the teachers. There is one of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, one of the things they did is they actually created a scholarship fund to send one of their members of their organization to a school to get an education to become a teacher so that she could teach the students this lost cause idea. So it becomes, again, very involved with sort of starting on the ground level. They have meetings where they quite literally hand them these pseudo-religious documents, these Confederate catechisms, where you're supposed to just read the catechism. You're supposed to just recite everything in there. No variations allowed. Question is, why did the South secede? And you had to give them the exact answer in the book, and they would repeat that, drill it into you. If you got it word for word, you'd get a prize. So, of course, that gave kids an incentive to read it, internalize it, and not think critically about it. And then, again, they get it at home. They get it from their churches. Sometimes they get it from their schools. And eventually they grow up to believe that this is 100% what it was about. There's a great book that I often have my students read because I think it really dives into all of this, and that is Apostles of Disunion by Charles B. Dew, who himself was a strong believer in the lost cause. He grew up as a son of the Confederacy, as a son of the South, and he actually put up like a Confederate flag in his college dorm until he started thinking about it a little bit more deeply, diving actually into the words of a lot of these people who are actively promoting the lost cause, and he starts to realize that this is sort of about slavery, that kind of everything that I've known, everything that society has taught me has sort of misled a little bit about what the actual cause is, sort of the question about it. So then he writes Apostles of Disunion, that I think is one of the greatest books, really, that kind of goes, sort of dissects the idea of states' rights argument versus sort of the slavery argument, because he focuses on these secession commissioners who actively went around the South saying, hey, secede from the country because we don't want them to take our slaves. Like, word for word, they all saying, hey, Georgia, you should leave too because you don't want them to take your slaves, do you? We like slavery. That's like, and then of course, years later, they said, oh, don't look at those documents, don't look at it, those ones don't matter, they were taken out of context. Things like that, they sort of hide the evidence, or at least try to talk over it. Because, the actual reality is, if you look at their actual words, they're much more upfront about it. Even the people who were saying, yeah, it's about slavery, 20 years later after the war is over, they come out and say, yeah, it was never about slavery. Like, they completely changed their mind to sort of tie into this argument. So I think it is something that kind of starts out, again, primarily women-driven, but focused primarily on children. That's where it starts. And then once you have a kid, sort of get the child invested, it becomes much harder to sort of unlearn that as you go.